If you've ever watched a sewing tutorial and thought, wait, what even is that? You're not alone. Between fabric bundles, tracing wheels, seam gauges, and all the measurements that don't seem to make sense, it can seem like everyone's speaking a language that you missed the memo on. So in this video, we're going to answer some of those what are they even talking about questions and make sense of some of the things that no one explains, especially if you're into sewing accessories like I am. And even if you've been sewing a while, stick around. There's a good chance you'll pick up something new. And I've got a treat at the end that'll make your sewing way easier. Hi, I'm Victoria and I help you sew practical, stylish accessories that are ready for real life and real adventures. So what's a bolt, a fat quarter, a yard, and what's the difference? Let's start with fabric because that's where a lot of confusion begins. When you walk into a fabric store, you'll see rows of those big rectangular bundles that look a lot like giant books lined up on the shelf. That's a bolt of fabric. It's how fabric is stored, measured, and sold. A bolt usually holds somewhere around 10 yards of fabric for quilting or craft cottons, although some can go up to 30 or even 100 yards depending on the fabric type and supplier. The width of the bolt, the short edge of the rectangle, is typically about 44 or 45 inches for craft fabrics. Apparel fabrics are often 54 to 60 inches wide, and some specialty fabrics like bedding or tablecloth can be as wide as 72 to 108 inches. The smaller pre-cut bundles you see, fat quarters, jelly rolls, and layer cakes, are all cut from the bolt. They just come pre-packaged in smaller, ready-to-use pieces. Fat quarters are my personal favorite. They're about 18 by 21 inches, which makes them perfect for the type of accessories I sew. Things like zipper pouches, cord wraps, or bottle holders. They're affordable, easy to mix and match, and you can usually get several small projects out of just one piece. And if you've ever seen the names jelly rolls or layer cakes, no, they're not dessert names. They're quilting terms for pre-cut bundles. Jelly rolls are strips about 2.5 inches wide and 42 to 44 inches long, and layer cakes are 10-inch by 10-inch squares. Quilters love them because the fabrics are already coordinated. With craft projects, I haven't had much need of these. Oh, and fabric is sold by the yard here in the US or by the meter in other parts of the world. I've included a quick conversion chart for you in a guide in case you're shopping internationally, because there are some really great stores with some really gorgeous fabrics online that you may want to check out. I also put together a reference of different bolt widths, fabric bundles, and how much you can realistically cut from them, so you'll have that for reference later. Now you've probably seen names like tracing wheel, awl, seam gauge, and wondered, what even are these? Well, let's go through a few that you might run into and what they actually do. First up is a tracing wheel, which looks a little bit like a tiny pizza cutter with a serrated edge, but it's not sharp. It's used with tracing paper to transfer markings from your pattern onto your fabric. You place the colored tracing paper face down on your fabric, put the pattern on top, and then roll the wheel along the lines. It leaves dotted marks that show you exactly where to sew or place details. It can be super handy when you've got a lot of markings or awkward placements that are hard to measure, like a pocket outline with multiple edges. But for simple, single line markings, I usually just reach for a disappearing fabric marker instead. It's faster and the marks vanish on their own. An awl tool, spelled A-W-L, is a slender pointed tool technically used for poking holes in fabric, like for inserting hardware or marking snap or button holes. But it's also great for guiding fabric near the presser foot when you're sewing tight spaces. I use mine all the time for small circular openings or spots where I need extra precision but don't want to get my fingers anywhere near the needle. Some awls can also fit through the center slot in a bias tape maker to help feed the fabric through. A point turner, sometimes called a seam creaser, is one of those tools that you don't think you need that much until you use it. It helps push out corners and smooth edges when you're turning a project right side out, especially on small pouches. It makes those corners look crisp instead of lumpy. And then there's the seam gauge, a tiny 6-inch ruler with a sliding marker. It's perfect for short, repeatable measurements like seam allowances, buttonholes, or double folds along the edge. I use mine all the time to mark a consistent 1/4 inch from the edge of a zipper or to keep hems even. It's light, quick, and one of those tools that just makes measuring less fussy. So let's talk about seam allowance. You know, that width between the cut edge of your fabric and the stitch line. It's basically the space that gives you room to join your fabric pieces together without the raw edges fraying apart. You'll see a few common sizes: 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, and 5/8. The reason there are so many is because it depends on what you're sewing and what type of fabric you're using. In garment construction, seam allowances are much more specific. There are all these different seam types and they serve different purposes depending on the fabric and where the seam goes. I really can't speak to that world because it's not the type of sewing that I do, but if that's your thing, those measurements are definitely worth paying attention to. In my case, accessory sewing and crafts, it's a lot simpler. I mainly use 1/4 inch seam allowance, sometimes 1/2, and that's it. For most of what I make, pouches, bags, bottle holders, and other accessories, that's all you need. 1/4 inch gives me a clean, efficient join, especially since I use an overedge stitch most of the time. Woven cotton fabrics, what I use the most, fray quite easily. So I use that stitch because it seals the raw edges and joins the fabric at the same time. And that stitch only needs about 1/4 inch. Now if I want a little extra room to maneuver or I know I'll be trimming something down later, I'll go with 1/2 inch instead. But I don't overthink it. I just do what works for the project. So does it matter? Yes and no. It matters for garment construction because fit and fabric type come into play. But for craft sewing, it's more flexible. Whatever seam allowance you choose, just account for that in the final dimension and stick with it throughout the rest of your project. And if this whole seam allowance thing still feels a little murky, I put together a visual guide identifying seam allowance measurements, when they're typically used, and identifying them on your machine. But more on that later. So how much fabric do you actually need to buy? Well, it depends. And I know, least satisfying answer ever. But hear me out. The first thing to keep in mind is fabric width. When you're buying fabric, the width tells you how much usable space you have to work with across the fabric. And that varies a lot. As I mentioned earlier, craft fabrics are typically 44 or 45 inches wide. Apparel, 54 or 60 inches wide. And specialty fabrics for things like bedding or tablecloths can be up to 72 or 108 inches wide. And if you're in a fabric store looking at the bolt, the fabric has been folded in half before being wrapped around the bolt. So the height you see on the shelf isn't the full width. Now here's where my brain short circuits a bit, because even though I know a yard equals 3 feet, it never really computes for me how much that actually is. I can't picture it in my head. If you're like me, you probably learned this in school and it just doesn't click when you're thinking about fabric. So here's a quick refresher. 1 yard equals 3 feet or 36 inches, 1/3 of a yard equals 12 inches, 1/2 a yard equals 18 inches, and 1/4 yard equals 9 inches. Honestly, thinking about it in inches is way easier for me than thinking about it in yards. It just clicks better visually. Now, of course, how many yards you need depends on what you're actually making. But here's one way to think about it. Let's say you're making a small zipper pouch, something about 5 inches tall and 7 inches wide, roughly the size of a photo frame. A yard of 44-inch wide fabric can easily get you about 35 of those, I think. I did say I was bad at math. So, for small accessories, a single yard can go surprisingly a long way. If you're shopping online, keep in mind that most stores sell fabric by the yard, not by the 1/2 or 1/4 yard. Mood Fabrics is one of the few that lets you order as little as a 1/2 yard, but that's not as common. In physical stores, they'll usually cut 1/2 yards, but typically not less. So if you just need a small piece, it's usually cheaper to grab a fat quarter that's already been pre-cut. And if you're not sure how to visualize yardage, or you want an easy way to convert between inches, yards, or even meters, I've made a full set of reference charts to help with that. Okay, let's talk about one thing that's tripped almost everyone up at some point: fractions. I mean, 3/8, 5/8, is it bigger than a 1/2? If you're like me, when you're starting out, the only ones that make sense are 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch, because they make sense, halves and quarters. But once I see awkward measurements like 8ths, my brain just sort of checks out. Math. Honestly, it didn't start to click for me until I found this little acrylic ruler with each measurement on its own tab. So you can literally see what 5/8 or 3/8 of an inch actually looks like. I'll link one like this below if you want to grab one because it's genuinely helpful. I've also made a printable version like it you can keep near your sewing machine. So here's the thing. Once you realize that every tick mark on a ruler or measuring tape represents a fraction of an inch, it makes a lot more sense. The longest lines are obviously an inch. The middle between is a half inch, and the next longest line between those is a quarter inch. Then eighths, and then those really tiny ones, the shortest ones, are sixteenths. Now you're smart, so I'm sure you already knew that. Me, on the other hand, I did mention I was bad at math, right? So if you've ever been frustrated or confused trying to visualize measurements like that, I've put together a full printable reference that labels all of those marks on a measuring tape, so you don't have to memorize which tick mark is which or count them every time. There are so many measurement tools: rulers, gauges, tapes, even yardsticks. And if you're just starting out, it can feel like you need to own an entire toolbox before you even sew anything. So let's talk about what you actually need and what's just nice to have. Different tools are made for different goals. Some measure long, flat cuts, some help you work around curves or corners, and some are for those tiny, precise measurements that would drive you crazy with a big ruler. Now, if you can only get two, I'd go for measuring tape and a seam gauge. Measuring tape is versatile. You can use it flat for cutting fabric or wrap it around things. It's what I used to measure around my water bottle when I was designing my water bottle holder pattern. So even in accessory sewing, it's super handy. And the seam gauge is tiny but mighty. I mentioned it earlier, that little 6-inch ruler with the sliding marker. It's perfect for short, consistent measurements like hems, double folds, spacing snaps, or buttons. You'll reach for it constantly. Now, if you can build out your toolkit a little bit more, there are a few rulers that make life easier. I have a 24-inch acrylic ruler that came with my cutting mat. It's great for cutting long, straight lines, especially when you use it with the mat's grid and angle markings for alignment. Then I have a small 4x4-inch ruler that's great for small cuts when a big one would just get in the way. I also have this little square ruler with tabs sticking out for common measurements: a quarter, 3/8, a half inch, and 5/8. It's great for checking seam allowances and even things like boxing out corners on tiny things. I recently used this 3/8 tab to measure out the corners on my mini snap pouch because it was that tiny. Then there's my curve ruler, which is helpful when I need to even out a curve, and a circle cutter, which helps you cut perfect circular shapes. And I have this circular template, which is basically a sheet of circles in different sizes. And that's what I use to get circles and rounded edges. Now, I've made a printable version for you that includes a bunch of these circles so that you'll have them anytime you need it. So yes, there are a lot of tools out there, but you don't really need all of them. Just start with the basics. Everything else just makes the process faster, more precise, potentially easier, depending on what it is that you're doing. But you don't have to go buy 6 different rulers just to get started. Now, if you're finding this video helpful so far, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you want more practical sewing content like this, plus the holiday sewing projects I have coming up, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss them. Alright, let's talk about one more thing that usually confuses a lot of beginners. Pattern markings. What do those symbols mean? Now, there are a lot of pattern markings out there, especially in garment sewing, but we're just going to cover the ones that you're most likely to see in craft or accessory patterns, plus a few others that come up here or there. First up are your cut lines. These are usually solid lines that show you exactly where to cut your fabric. Then you've got fold lines. There are 2 different types. First are the ones that say place on fold or have arrows pointing down towards a straight edge. That means you're supposed to place the edge of your pattern along a folded piece of fabric so that when you cut it out and open it up, you get a perfectly mirrored shape. The second is just a dashed line indicating where to fold the fabric during the construction of a project, such as a fold over the top of the piece. This is something that I often add to my patterns. You'll also see seam allowance guides or placement guides, which are usually dotted or dashed lines. Seam allowance lines show you where your stitching should go. Placement guides mark where things like straps, pockets, or snaps should go. In my patterns, these are labeled both in the key and on the specific piece, so you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Another marking that shows up in printed PDF patterns like mine is the page alignment mark. On my patterns, it's a diamond shape that sits right on the edge of the page border. When you're assembling a tiled PDF pattern, that diamond line shows exactly where to line up to the next page, so everything matches up perfectly. Now, a few extra symbols you might run into. Stitching lines often dashed showing where you'll actually sew. Notches, little triangles or diamonds that help match pieces together. Darts, those pointed V shapes that add shaping in garments. You won't usually see these in accessories. Grain line arrows, long double-headed arrows that show you which direction the fabric should run. For most craft projects, this isn't critical, but it matters a lot more for garments or something like bias tape. Every pattern has its own key that explains what each marking means. So if you feel unsure, check that first. In my patterns, the key is right at the beginning, and it breaks down the line styles and weights for cut lines, seam allowances, folds, and placement markings. For craft and accessory patterns, that's all that you really need to worry about. Nothing too scary. Once you get familiar with those basics, pattern markings stop looking like hieroglyphics and start to make a lot more sense. Now what I've been waiting to tell you about. So we've covered a lot, and that's why I decided to create something that puts all of this together in one place. It's called the Sewing Measurement Guide, and it's basically your one-stop reference for everything we've been talking about and more. It's not just text, it's designed to be something that you'll actually use and continually reference. Inside, you'll find sections on seam allowances and machine settings, fabric yardage and bundles, and measurement tools, all explained in plain language and illustrated so you can see exactly what's what. There's also a full set of conversion and comparison charts, so you never have to guess about fractions, inches, how far a yard will go, or yardage compared to meters if you're ordering internationally. And one of my favorite parts, the printable rulers and templates. You get a seam allowance ruler with multiple widths, a measuring tape with all the tick marks labeled, printable circles in various sizes, and other ruler guides. They're not just reference charts, they're working tools. Basically, if you've thought, I wish all of this measurement info was just located in one place, this is that place. It's the guide I wish I had when I first started sewing accessories. Something simple, visual, and complete. You can grab your copy through the link in the description below. It's a paid guide, but it's designed to save you hours of searching, second guessing, and counting tick marks. Trust me, once you have it printed and beside your machine, you'll wonder how you ever sewed without it. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope this sewing measurement guide makes your next project a whole lot easier. You can find all my sewing patterns, both free and paid, linked below if you want to check those out. And next week, I'll be showing you some Christmas gift ideas to sew. Yes, it's that time already. But in the meantime, if you're looking for fun sewing projects right now, go watch this one for some fall sewing ideas. See you next time. Bye!